here's the deal. We got a great show for you today. And we got just like amazing guests. And we're going to get into that and who they are very shortly. Going to keep you in suspense for a little bit. But I just wanted to update people. You probably know this, but welcome to the Katie Halper Show. Like, subscribe, join the Patreon, join the show as members. And as people probably know, on Monday, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, reduced the number of days that infected patients should remain isolated to 5 days from 10. Anyone leaving isolation must be free of symptoms and should wear a mask when near others for an additional 5 days. Lo and behold, guys, this coincides perfectly with the request made by the CEO of Delta Airlines, who wrote a letter to the CDC saying, with the rapid spread of the Omicron variant, the 10-day isolation for those who are fully vaccinated may significantly impact our workforce and operations. Similar to healthcare, police, fire, and public transportation workforces, the Omicron surge may exacerbate shortages and create significant disruptions. So we're going to talk about this decision, what motivated it, what these disruptions mean, what kind of fallout there'll be from the shortened isolation periods, and also kind of discuss global health, public health in a larger context, and how we can balance that with the needs and demands of capitalism. And maybe we can't. We're going to have to sit tight and figure that one out. We're going to figure that all of that out on the show. And helping us do that are none other than our two esteemed guests, Dr. Oni Blackstock, a primary care and HIV physician, founder and executive director of Health Justice, and former assistant commissioner at the New York City Health Department, and Justin Feldman, an epidemiologist and research fellow at the Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, who's written at JAMA and all the AMAs and Jacobin. So without further ado, let's bring on our two doctors in different ways, but both doctors nonetheless. Hello, welcome.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. And just wanted to go over, I guess I have a lot of questions for you guys in terms of public health more generally, but I thought we could start with the news of the day. And I want to know your guys' responses to these new guidelines, what your thoughts on them are. Okay, last tech issue for the night, I promise. I usually have like one of these things going, but not all at once. So you're in for a treat. Okay, historic moment. All right. Do you want either of you can start? Dr. Blackstock.
Go for it, Oni.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. I was, I think, probably shocked, like many other folks, to hear of this change in the guidance with respect to isolation, duration, and quarantine. I think there are a lot of aspects of it that are incredibly questionable and do not appear to be based in science. You know, a lot of it is based on what we know about Delta. We're learning a lot about Omicron. We don't really have a grasp on, the duration of infectiousness, the fact that there was no testing requirement that was part of the guidance was problematic. Also, this the recommendation around wearing a mask for the last 5 days. I mean, we know that there's been, extreme anti-mask sentiment. I mean, many people don't know how to wear their mask properly. So really concerns about whether people can adhere to this. And, all the while we're going through this Delta plus Omicron surge. I think people are fatigued, people are exhausted, people are trying to stay alive and protect themselves. And then to have this guidance come out that does not appear to be based in science, that appears to be driven purely by business interests, is very disheartening and I think discouraging for many.
Yeah, and I'll just say this entire pandemic in the US, workers have been unprotected for the most part by US policy. Under the Trump administration, there was no OSHA regulation protecting workers for COVID. In the Biden administration, there was an attempt by OSHA to issue a pretty comprehensive regulation that would cover most workers in the US. It would have included, among other things, paid time off when you are infected or exposed. For businesses with 10 or more workers. It disappeared, it was killed by the White House after lobbying by business interests, disappeared in May. There was almost no media reporting on it. Fast forward to today, and we're at this point where there's really no laws in most states protecting workers. So this is just guidance that in many cases businesses voluntarily follow. And they're going to, if they are following it, they're going to be providing a less protective policy that's going to leave, in many cases, workers in the workplace while contagious with a highly contagious variant, and that's going to infect their coworkers.
Right. And just to add, like, there's just so much that could be done. I mean, right now, society is like wide open. I think, as Justin was saying, again, very little protections for workers, but just very little protections for the general public. I'm here in New York City. We have Broadway shows going on. New Year's Eve and Times Square is still planned, yet they've decided to, change this guidance when there are many other mitigation measures that could be taken to protect workers and the public in general.
Yeah, and I think that this coincides so interestingly with Biden's statement to governors that there's no federal solution to COVID. So we have Biden saying that, and then we have the CDC making a decision that even they seem to be admitting is not entirely science-based. I mean, to be fair, they're admitting that this is about, they have various euphemisms for it, disruption, what they want to do as much as people can tolerate, they said. I actually have some video clips. I thought we could look at some of them if that's okay with you guys. Oh, and this is something that you posted this, Justin. This is something the CDC put out. My job puts me at high risk for COVID-19 exposure. I got vaccinated because it's better to be protected than to be out sick. And I think you suggested that you're not a CDC communications expert, but you thought maybe this messaging was a little unwise. What's your hot take on this?
Yeah, so I mean, to me, it just gets to the very darkness of the moment we're in, where workers in 2020 actually had paid sick days for the most part under a temporary act that was passed. It expired. Unemployment, additional unemployment assistance also expired, was not renewed. There was no attempt to renew it after September. So you have workers who are being told that they need to get vaccinated so they're able to eat, so they don't starve. It's just pretty dark. I'm all for workers getting vaccinated. I'm all for the attempted OSHA rule to vaccinate all workers, but this is not it. This just gets to the kind of dystopian place that the Biden administration and the whole political system in the U.S.,
Sure.
but especially the Biden administration has put us in.
Right, because it takes for granted, right, that your work is putting you at high risk for COVID.
Yeah, and you shouldn't, exactly. The government isn't protecting workers, right, and employers aren't protecting workers. And this was also created prior to Omicron, I think. I think they first started running the ad early December when there wasn't much known about Omicron. Because the vaccines, while still protecting reasonably well against hospitalization and death, aren't protecting very well against infection. So you do want people to be missing work, even if you're vaccinated, precisely to avoid infecting others.
Right. Missing work without losing their jobs.
Exactly.
Right. So, and it's funny because the CDC had another, I guess maybe it's like the same person is doing their outreach, but they had another infographic where it was like, it's so expensive to go to the hospital. Like, and it showed how much money you have to spend. So get vaccinated, which again, people should get vaccinated, but also it's a problem that it's so expensive if you have to go to the hospital. So they're just like laying it bare. They're just, they're unintentional, like big critics of capitalism. They don't even realize it.
Yeah. And just to say, like, just having worked for a local health department, you know, I think we just have to be aware there are very bright people at the CDC. I would have to assume that they're under significant pressure by business interests and by federal leadership to sort of adopt this type of guidance. And then just in terms of the ads, I mean, often health departments or CDC, they have like other they've, you know, ad companies helping to develop and vet some of these ads,
Yeah.
but clearly getting community input and public input on the appropriateness of the ads is incredibly important. And that's usually actually something that doesn't happen for health departments and government agencies.
Right. So this is, I wanted to just show some clips. Let me see. How do I actually play this one? Maybe they don't play. Hold on. Sorry. I may have to actually just share them. You know what? Let's play. We're going to play them a different way, not the slideshow. But Brad, can we play the Fauci on Chris Hayes clip, please?
Today, the U.S. set a new record high for COVID cases with a 7-day average of new daily cases at over 250,000, topping the old mark set last January before vaccines were widely available, but of course before Omicron. This comes a day after the CDC updated its guidance, recommending shorter isolation and quarantine time periods. Yesterday, when that news crossed, going down from 10 to 5 days for people who are asymptomatic, I saw an incredibly strong reaction both online, commentators, people I knew, people in public health. It was very polarized. Some people reacting, yes, finally, it's done. They haven't done this earlier. Other people said, no, this is catastrophic. So the decision has inspired strong feelings and also a little bit of confusion on what the actual guidance is. Joining me now is Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the chief medical advisor to President Joe Biden. Dr. Fauci, let's just start with what the actual guidance is. My understanding is it's 5 days of isolation if you're asymptomatic. But what does that mean? Like, what if I'm symptomatic for 2 days and asymptomatic for 3? Like, how does that cash out in real life?
Well, let's start with the completely asymptomatic first, Chris, because we want to make sure that fundamental issue gets understood. The underlying
and feel free, let me know if you want me to stop at any point, or if not, I have some places to
purpose of taking what would normally be, if I'm infected and without symptoms, normally I would have to be isolated for 10 days. Right now, because of the concern that there are so many people now and likely in the next few weeks who will be infected by this wave of infections that we're getting with Omicron, many of whom will be without symptoms or only mildly symptomatic, that might have a negative impact on our ability to maintain the structure of society, of all the essential workers that you would need if you keep them all out for a period of 10 days. So the consideration and the decision on the part of the CDC was, let's look and see if we could cut that in half to 5 days.
Can we pause?
Yes.
So there's something misleading going on, which is he's talking about essential workers and preserving the function of society. That's
the
something
structure of society, I believe. Yeah.
That's something that was language that we heard in March and April of 2020 when there were some paid shutdowns, when people got pandemic unemployment assistance to go home and keep themselves safe. But we have these essential workers stay, a minority of workers stay at their jobs. This rule, this guidance rather, does not only apply to essential workers. It's meant to apply to the people at the mall, at the restaurants, at businesses that could either be restricted or closed in a different world, or in other countries like in Canada, which is temporarily closing some businesses.
So you're saying that he's kind of making it seem like he's talking about essential workers, but this is something for all workers.
Exactly.
And he's using language to make it, right. I mean, I'm not someone who hates Fauci, and one of the reasons I'm so frustrated by this is because it gives, I think, there's so much skepticism already about and vaccine hesitancy, and this to me just gives so much ammo to people who are either confused or have lost faith or trust. And it's like, you shouldn't be undermining yourselves like this.
Yeah. I mean, I just have to say, just having worked for a health department, again, it's not the CDC, but I suspect they are just having to follow what the party line is and what they're being told. I mean, these are incredibly bright folks. I mean, I do have to say, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Walensky, like, they're not public health people, like, they're medical people.
Right.
So I think we actually don't have public health leadership, really, as part of this White House response, which is like a whole nother but related issue.
Right.
Yeah, and the person you're not seeing in all of this is the person with the most power over pandemic response, Jeff Zients.
Right.
He is as little of a public health person as one can be. He has a background in private equity, Bain Capital. He's the one who's really running the show with COVID response policy, and we're seeing people like Fauci and Walensky having to sell policies not made by them.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Let's keep going. Love this stuff. Oops.
What the actual guidance is. Joining me now is Dr. Anthony. How does that cash out in real life?
Well, let's start with the completely asymptomatic first, Chris, because we want to make sure that fundamental issue gets understood. The underlying purpose of taking what would normally be, if I'm infected and without symptoms, normally I would have to be isolated for 10 days. Right now, because of the concern that there are so many people now and likely in the next few weeks who will be infected by this wave of infections that we're getting with Omicron, many of whom will be without symptoms or only mildly symptomatic, that might have a negative impact on our ability to maintain the structure of society, of all the essential workers that you would need if you keep them all out for a period of 10 days. So the consideration and the decision on the part of the CDC was, let's look and see if we could cut that in half to 5 days. So what happens is that you're isolated for 5 days, and then if you're still asymptomatic, at the end of that 5 days, you can go out and do your job and re-enter society, hopefully getting functions of society normal, but you have to wear a mask. That's the fundamental matrix of the issue. The questions arise of what happened if I'm... Go ahead, please answer.
Well, no, that was a very honest and clarifying answer, because you are talking about policy judgment in a context of trade-offs between different consequences. So stopping the spread of a highly communicable infectious disease is one thing that we want to do. Allowing, as you said, society to function. Obviously, like, you don't want everyone at the local water treatment facility to be out in quarantine for 10 days with none of the skilled technicians running it, for one example, okay?
Correct.
And I get that, and I think it's a very forthright explanation, but I guess the question is, like, is there any science backing up the idea that after 5 days of asymptomatic isolation that you're not still shedding virus and contagions?
Yeah. Nothing is going to be 100%, and this is one of those situations when you're dealing with a very difficult situation, Chris, that we often say you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. The fact is that we know that when you are infected early on in infection, for the first several days, you have more of a likelihood to have a high level of virus and to be capable of spreading it. As you get into the second half of that 10-day period, we know that the virus in general, not for every single 100% of the people, but for most of the time, for most of the people, that level of virus diminishes to the point where the CDC feels, and I don't disagree with them at all, that wearing a mask is ample protection during that second half of a 10-day period. When you balance that...
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, they're just, a lot of, like, concerning issues with what he's saying. I mean, I think, just in terms of wearing a mask, like, many people, the guidance from the CDC around, like, well-fitted masks, I think is the terminology they use. I think it's either for, like, a cloth mask or maybe a surgical mask. We're not talking about, like, N95 masks, and we know that many Americans don't have access to these higher grade masks so that they can protect themselves. And then I just wanted to add also that, we know some of these like the Delta Airlines CEO, sort of reached out and was, with Dr. Carlos Del Rio and I guess their medical director to ask about the shortening of the isolation period. But they had also asked around about a testing requirement where CDC completely dispensed with any testing requirement. I think we're all clear as to why, because of the lack of availability of tests. But the fact that they're not honest about why there's no testing requirement, I think is further erodes any existing trust that was present previous to Monday,
Right.
or to yesterday. I'm losing track of time. Just the fact that they're just not being honest. And I think, all these people are in very challenging positions, but this is just not helpful at all.
Right. Yeah. Justin, anything to add? If not, I'll go back to the video.
It's just very frustrating to watch. And, I think this was yesterday. Today, there's been many more appearances by Rochelle Walensky and by the deputy director of CDC trying to explain the science behind the decision. And there really isn't much.
Yeah. So that, I guess the question is Chris Hedges, Chris Hayes, when he mentions the water purifier example, right? He's like, well, you obviously need some people back to work. So how do we balance needing, for instance, as you pointed out, though, this isn't just about essential workers, right? That's part of the issue. But how should we be balancing the needs of people, of patients with the needs of healthcare workers, kind of more generally? Or is that kind of a different discussion since what we're talking about isn't essential and healthcare workers?
Yeah, I think if you're talking about how do we do a better response, I think right now we're at such a high level of spread that in so many places hospitals are going to be overwhelmed. And we've seen, I've been tracking the data in New York City in the last week, hospitalizations have more than doubled. There's still plenty of capacity so far, but what if it keeps doubling? We really don't know where it's going to end. And in other places in the country really have very little hospital capacity and are still only dealing with Delta. Omicron hasn't even hit. So I think what you want to do ideally is make the resources available to keep people safe temporarily we used to call it flatten the curve, make sure the healthcare system doesn't get overrun. And then the remaining workers who have to go in person, I would like to see them get hazard pay, and I would like to see them get a very high level of occupational protections, ventilation, N95 masks, etc.
But how are we going to pay for it, as they always ask about everything but the Pentagon?
There's funding that was sent to the states. So many states do have, resources to do a lot of this. I just think that there need to be, the Biden administration needs to use whatever levers of control that it has, and it really hasn't sort of maximized those. So even things like creating, guidance for states about, mask policies. So what are the levels of community transmission at which we want to make sure that we have people masked in indoor public places? There's just very little guidance that has been developed at the federal level for states and localities. And we know that a lot of state policy can be influenced by federal guidance, and that's really not happening. The CDC has really stepped back, and part of Biden's initial plan was really about working with state governors, working with local jurisdictions to get them to adopt a number of these policies. And it seems like the White House has just really given up.
Right. In a way that, there have been these memes going around, how it started, how it's going. Thank you. I seem so out of touch. How it started, how it's going. And it shows Trump saying something comparable to what Biden is saying now. And then people get defensive, how could you compare the two? But the point is, one of them is president right now. So some people who are saying, but Trump, that's not enough. You can't just say that. You can't just do the but Trump thing, because Trump isn't president. And the other thing is, of course we should be pushing Biden. Biden's press secretary joked about how ridiculous it was to give out free tests. And then lo and behold, that became a policy. So, you know, to my brothers and sisters out there who are feeling protective of Biden, you're doing him a favor. To all three of you watching the show tonight, who define themselves that way. But we also have some Walensky that we can listen to. Yes. Don't worry, we have more Walensky where that came from.
From what you're saying, it sounds like this decision had just as much to do with business as it did with the science.
Well, so it really had a lot to do with what we thought people would be able to tolerate. We have seen relatively low rates of isolation for all of this pandemic. Some science has demonstrated less than a third of people are isolating when they need to. And so we really want to make sure that we had guidance in this moment where we were going to have a lot of disease that could be adhered to, that people were willing to adhere to, and that spoke specifically to when people were maximally infectious. So it really spoke to both behaviors as well as what people were able to do. Well,
okay, so that's one thing. And then I don't know why this one isn't playing, where she says something about how it's probably okay. It's a little bit vague.
If I can intervene on that first clip.
Yeah, of course.
She's talking about people. It's not really about people. Like, yes, there are individuals in their own capacity who go to the CDC website after they're infected or exposed to say, okay, what do I do now? But that's really not what this is about. This is about policy, and it's largely about businesses and their quarantine and isolation policies that they adopt voluntarily. And in some states, it does have force of law. In some states, there are protections for workers who are quarantining and isolating. So she's putting it on the individual when it's really about business.
Yeah.
Right. And just to add to Justin's point, like that's just been the CDC's approach in general. Like this has been a very individual sort of level response in terms of people like get out, get vaccinated, and blame people for being unvaccinated for the situation we're in, as opposed to the reason we're here is because we haven't had the appropriate policies in place.
Right. There's a lot of shaming that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see. Let's see if this one works. And if not. All right. Well, now for something completely different, or a little different, we're going to see the wonderful, I don't know, I think the CDC and the NSA and the CIA, they're all interfering with my stream here. Can't play the Sarah. I want to play
the new
response
CDC guidance that cuts that isolation period for most people who are asymptomatic in half. Joining me now is the international president of the Association of the Flight Attendants Union.
One second. Sorry about that. Brad, maybe you want to re-upload that one too. Let's see.
Michelle Walensky is the director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Dr. Walensky, good morning. Thanks for joining us. We want to start, if we can, with the CDC's recent decision to cut that isolation period in half. Given that you and other public officials have acknowledged that it wasn't exclusively science, but also those possible staffing shortages that played a role in this decision, should Americans feel safe?
Good morning, Peter. Thanks so much for having me. So we followed numerous areas of science in making this important decision. One, of course, was how the virus behaves. How much virus do you still have that you could potentially transmit after 5 days? And we generally know that most of your transmission potential happens in those 1 to 2 days before you have symptoms and those 2 to 3 days after. So by the time 5 days of isolation has occurred, you probably have about 85 to 90% of all of your transmission potential behind you while you've been in isolation. Importantly, also to that decision was where we are in the epidemiology of this disease. Skyrocketing case numbers, as you have noted, we anticipate they could get even higher. And many people are asymptomatic or only mildly symptomatic, especially those who have been vaccinated or boosted. And so they may very well not be able to or willing to comply with 10 days worth of isolation. So this was really a way to tell people, make sure you isolate in those first 5 days when you're maximally infectious. And then, of course, wear a mask for those last 5 days to make sure that you don't spread anything that might be left over to others.
Well, Dr. Walensky, let's put this into real terms.
Okay. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's kind of more of the same, talking about individuals rather than businesses, and that like we've gone through the mask stuff, and then yeah, she's throwing out some numbers, percent when people are infectious. It's not exactly clear what she means by that, and according to the New York Times, she's talking about some internal modeling they did based on the Delta variant, not the Omicron variant.
Right. Yeah. And she seems to, I mean, I'm not a scientist or a doctor, but she throws around a lot of like probably and generally.
Right. Well, I think there's like a lot of uncertainty, and I think like it's helpful, you know, as a public health person or scientist to say, you know, when there is uncertainty. But we do know there's a lot of variability in terms of like duration of time during which people are infectious. And so does she want to be around like a colleague who's in those last 5 days, like wearing a mask? Like, would she feel comfortable? This is like the reality. I think most people would probably say they wouldn't want to be around someone who is potentially, you know, infectious, even if they're wearing a mask.
Right. Someone let's see. Bus God writes, Dem leadership is asymptomatic progressive. I don't even know if they would diagnose themselves as progressive, but they certainly are not showing symptoms. Okay, here and now we have a.
During one of the busiest travel seasons of the year, airlines have canceled flights by the thousands as the Omicron variant is taking a toll on their staffing. Now the nation's largest flight attendant union is weighing in on the new CDC guidance that cuts that isolation period for most people who are asymptomatic in half. Joining me now is the international president of the Association of the Flight Attendants Union, Sarah Nelson. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And first, I just want to get your reaction to this new guidance.
Well, look, this came in the middle of the busy holiday season at the behest of Delta Airlines when they started to see that they were going to have staffing troubles. Other airlines negotiated incentive pay to try to get through the holiday period. Delta did not do that and doesn't have unions. And so CDC responded with a cut in half of the isolation time when someone is infected, with no testing before going back out into public, but with two key points: that you are asymptomatic and that you continue to wear a mask. It's really important that we lift this up, and CDC should also be recommending, if they're going to fall in line with what the airlines want, that the airlines also say how they are going to implement this to make sure that it is only for people who are asymptomatic who are coming back to work, so that people are not forced to come back to work when they're still sick, and how they are going to implement ensuring that masks are worn at all times, including in the flight deck.
Right. And so they say that people should continue to wear a mask for those 5 days after they are asymptomatic, they go back to work. But you talked about, you know, the CDC citing the science here as the driving force behind this decision. But you said the fact that it aligns with the number of days pushed by corporate America is, quote, less than reassuring.
Look, it was totally transparent here. This was asked for as these staffing issues were being put in place. Delta's statement after this policy was put into place had not an ounce of public safety in it, but it was all about the staffing issues. That's what was argued on the front end. That's how your segment started today. And that is the quick response from CDC in the middle of this holiday season to try to address that, rather than be focused on public health policies. And I want to make it very clear, the CDC should be loud and clear about implementation here, because no worker should be forced to come to work when they are still sick. And that is, I believe, what we are going to see here. We're very concerned about that.
Yeah. Just to add, I think I saw like a tweet on Twitter today or yesterday, a viral tweet where I guess someone was diagnosed with COVID-19 and told their boss, and boss was like, "Oh, don't worry, if it's mild, just come in." So I think, you know, this is probably going to be, you know, happening, you know, throughout the country, and obviously it's incredibly concerning and will obviously potentially worsen the current situation we're in. So none of it really makes much sense.
Yeah.
And the Biden administration, I think, is worth noting, actually went much further than the airlines asked of them. The airlines were saying, if you're vaccinated and have a test and are asymptomatic, you can come back. They're not, the Biden administration is not put in any of those in the guidance. They're saying any job, doesn't matter vaccination status, doesn't matter if you test positive or don't test at all. If your symptoms are resolving, whatever that means. It seems like what's happened here is the Biden administration saw thousands of flights canceled over the holiday season. And in New York City, where Omicron seems to have a little head start, they're seeing many businesses close down. And they're worried about their economic goals. They're worried about businesses shutting down. They're worried about inflation, that sort of thing. So they're pushing workers to put their lives on the line for their understanding of economic progress.
Right. What about, to play devil's advocate, what about the fact, people say, well, we need economies to function. We need the economy to function because, that's for the little people, not just corporation, not just corporate America, but people can't afford inflation. And you hear all these arguments. So what's your response to that?
Well, just to say, I think when we look at like countries across the world that have like prioritized like the health of their citizens, like those are the ones that have then been able to really maintain relatively strong economies, and those that have not prioritized the health of their citizens then have had really struggling economies. So the reality is that, if we were having unabated spread of this virus, people are not going to be able to show up. Like Omicron's going to shut things down. So instead of having Omicron shut things down, let's do this in a way that like is sensible and really prioritizes the health and well-being of Americans and American workers.
Yeah, and I'd put it this way. There's a major new risk in society, COVID, and someone has to pay for it. Either government and business can pay for it, or workers can pay for it with their lives. I did research covering the first year of the pandemic, and I found that if working age people of color who had high school degrees or less, so people of color who are working class, if they died at the same rate of college educated white people, 90% fewer of them would have died. So we really have both a classed and racialized pandemic that is having extremely unequal impacts depending on who you are and the kind of work you do and the kind of housing you're able to live in.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because obviously both of you focus on this issue, and health justice is about centering anti-racism and centering equity. And Justin, you also wrote a piece about the way that people discuss socializing as risky behavior, but not work as risky behavior. And you mentioned some really interesting statistics that have to do with how racialized it is. Can you share that?
Yeah, so I mean, so this was a piece I wrote in Jacobin in the first year of the pandemic, largely before vaccination. And I was finding in state after state, Democrat and Republican governors were blaming the spread of COVID on small social gatherings in people's homes, at parties, whatever. And they were ignoring or even denying the role of occupational exposure. And one of the things that is not explained by this sort of social gathering explanation is why there's such huge racial inequalities. For Latino workers, for instance, their rate of excess death in the first year was among the highest of any group. And normally Latinos have lower mortality rates overall than white people. And that really points to the kinds of high risk jobs they're doing. And that continues even in, I looked at between August and December in the so-called pandemic of the unvaccinated period, where a lot of commentators were blaming Republican, white, old right-wingers who refused to get vaccinated for the whole pandemic. During that time period, the death rate was 30% higher for Black and Latino people, and double that of white people for Native Americans, and about 4 times higher that of white people or Pacific Islanders in the U.S.
Yeah, no, just to piggyback, I just talk a lot about like occupational like segregation and how a number of like policies from even decades ago have really, and existing policies have worked to really concentrate Black and Latino workers, obviously in occupations that put them at increased risk, that also have like limited benefits, so they are unable to really access healthcare when they need it. And so it's like the perfect storm, I think, to really speak to what Justin was talking about.
Yeah. And speaking of responsibility and blaming the individual, I just have to show this clip from, it's Anderson Cooper with Bill Gates.
Do you think the federal government or state governments, or the very least federal government, should mandate if you want to get on an airplane, you have to be vaccinated? If you want to get Social Security, you need to be vaccinated. If you want to get whatever benefits they give, you need to be vaccinated for. Is that something that the U.S. can and should do?
So
do you think the federal government?
Weird. I was not expecting that. He basically asks, I mean, I've heard people discuss vaccines for flights,
right,
but not for Social Security, except for some like total blue check Twitter people who, you know, I'm trying to be diplomatic, but certain types of people I've heard make that argument, which I've always found pretty scary and counterproductive. And just to in full disclosure, Bill Gates, or full transparency, Gates said, well, certainly if you take a case like nursing homes where, you know, we are seeing transmission primarily through unvaccinated people, there you can make a very compelling case. If once you get far beyond that, the question is, will it work to get people to be more to seek out the vaccine? You know, one elderly care home said, hey, if I require it, but the others don't, you know, I simply have less workers. And so you have to step back and think through this whole system. But, you know, I would hope that we get to 80%. I would hope we can get to 90%. But, you know, today we're stalled out for a little bit. Now a teeny bit of acceleration as people realize Delta has changed the rules. So luckily he does not jump on that bandwagon that I guess Anderson Cooper is not on, but perhaps nudging or something. I don't know what the right metaphor would be.
About that was odd.
Yeah,
that was odd. That was a bit of a jump. But I think we obviously don't want to be punitive to folks. I think we want to like incentivize folks getting vaccinated and figure out what resonates with folks and what would get them interested. But I think it also just speaks to like this over emphasis and focus on this vaccine only and very vaccine-centric approach that the federal response has had, as opposed to like thinking about like what are, you know, the vaccine in addition to the many other measures that can be taken to really keep everybody safe. So,
right. Yeah, I mean, I actually heard Chuck Todd kind of suggest that too, so I guess I shouldn't be that surprised. But I think he floated like taking away unemployment benefits, which is so great because you're literally saying that these people are risky because they're not vaccinated. We're going to take away their unemployment benefits. Guess what they're going to do?
And approaches like that often cause people to like dig in more, like and not trust more. So I think it's going to be very unproductive.
Yeah, I mean it's like it's terrible. Yeah.
And I just think that making that video with Bill Gates asking those questions, his reaction is just like very poor image consciousness. he has PR people who should have prevented that interview from even happening. That interview itself fuels vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, yeah, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I think people are so used to being in their own bubbles that they don't even like, they have no idea how someone would take this video who doesn't already agree with them. But again, as you pointed out, it is of course going to cause people to dig in that much more. I mean, especially if you're using like illogical, vindictive things. It's not even, there's like no, how does that work out? That doesn't work out at all. I mean, I've heard people make the argument that, and this is not good either, but there's at least the logic, and I'm not advocating for this. People are like, oh, they shouldn't be able to take up hospital beds if they're not vaccinated, which I think is a bad argument, but that has a pretense of logic to it. This just doesn't even make any sense. But speaking of like the micro individual versus the macro societal, you, Dr. Blackstock, really talk about this when you address vaccine apartheid.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could kind of just, I know it's different from this, but it's also related in terms of there's this sense that the Biden administration is doing all it can do. And you addressed in an address, you basically shed light on how that's not true, that there's a lot more that can be done. Could you speak on that?
Sure. Yeah. So we're probably in this current situation potentially, in terms of Omicron, because, there are large swaths of the world that don't have access to, effective COVID-19 vaccines. And so, but the Biden administration obviously has been appealed to by many activists and advocates and public health experts to really use whatever influence and whatever political means and diplomatic means can be used to really, well, for one thing, is get the World Health Organization, get the EU and Switzerland and some other countries to sign on to what's called the TRIPS waiver, which would allow some of these intellectual property rights to be waived so that some of the sort of know-how and recipes for vaccine could be shared with manufacturers or vaccine makers in the global South and other parts of the world. And, he signed up, and back in May, he said he was like behind this and it was great, but really everything is really stalled and we haven't really seen much progress. I think this issue of global vaccine equity came back up when we heard about Omicron being detected. We don't know if that's where it emerged, but first detected in South Africa and potentially Botswana, detected, just to make it clear. And then we saw those really sort of knee-jerk travel bans happening. But basically, just speaking to the point is just that the Biden administration clearly needs to do a lot more in terms of ensuring that the global South gets access to vaccines, and donations are not enough. They're very inconsistent. Like if people are getting like a trickle here and then a whole bunch there, they're not able to really develop sort of the infrastructure and processes needed to get vaccines to folks. So Biden still needs to step up and do what he needs to do, and in particular around the Moderna vaccine, where there's the potential there that there are National Institute of Health researchers who are thought to be behind the creation of the vaccine. And so if that is the case, the US can actually share the recipe and know-how and technology with vaccine makers in other countries. And that's been stalled and not happening. So we don't realize how interconnected we are. And obviously viruses know no boundaries. And
Right.
So, as long as there are people in parts of the world who are not vaccinated, then we're going to deal with these situations again and again.
Right. And so these people are smart. They know this. So why aren't they doing everything they can?
Because these vaccine makers, the Pfizer's, Moderna, they have a great deal of influence on politicians, on the president, and the president's unwilling to take the stand that he needs to.
Yeah. Which again is really scary and just, I think, further contributes to the extent that people think about this or know about this, but I think they have to. A lot of people, it just contributes to this erosion. And I understand part of it, but I just disagree with what should be done about it. For me, that doesn't mean so don't get vaccinated, but it's very hard to say well, listen to them. They want to save lives unless it conflicts with big
Right.
pharma. They want to save lives unless it conflicts with, the bottom line of certain corporations. How can we? It makes our job so much harder. Your guys' jobs as people in this medical field. What do? I just rant, but it does really undermine the credibility of these institutions, and it's just infuriating. And the truth is, they are willing to sacrifice lives for money.
Yes.
I know
and we rant too. That's what we do on Twitter.
Yeah.
That's all good.
Right. Yeah. You guys have to follow both of them on Twitter. And why do you think it's I was thinking about this because, of course, Desmond Tutu just passed, and can you explain why it's being framed by some as an apartheid issue?
Oh, okay, yeah. Because
why it's a useful framing,
right? So I just think this idea of inequity of certain countries having access to certain resources and opportunities to sort of live, a vaccine, a virus-free life versus other countries where that's not the reality and where they don't have the resources to do so. And I think, just given especially the for-profit aspect to a lot of this as well, these vaccine makers know that they're not going to be able to make a lot of money or much of a profit by selling to many of these countries. And so they're focused on like the European countries, United States, potentially Asian countries, and really don't see many like sub-Saharan African countries, for instance, as potential customers. So so just in terms of this sort of chasm or this dichotomy in terms of what people have access to.
Right. So I was talking about this with someone the other day, and she said she kind of pushed back on my vilification of the Biden administration for not doing more about vaccine apartheid, and said that, well, there's also a lot of vaccine hesitancy. So wouldn't it just not be used?
So people have looked at this. There's like a really good, I think, op-ed written about this. So vaccine hesitancy, yes, that exists, but that is not what is driving this 100%. A lot of this has to do with just lack of access to vaccines and also the support to develop like an infrastructure for also providing the vaccine. And so a lot of people are attributing it to vaccine hesitancy, but there are like, over 1 billion people living on the African continent. And so vaccine hesitancy also varies from country to country, from city to city. But many, and the vast majority of people, if they had access to a vaccine, said that they would, when surveyed in different countries, said that they would be open to getting a vaccine and they would want a vaccine. So I think that's like an easy excuse when we know that, at least provide people a vaccine and let them have the option of whether they want to take it or not.
Yeah. Like you were saying, gives them, it's harder you can't really like build an infrastructure or build incentives around something that is like so scarce.
Right, exactly. And then also just to say that COVAX, that whole initiative where like all these wealthy countries were supposed to be donating vaccines, that's also very well behind. Like many of the countries that promised a certain amount of vaccines have not fulfilled their promises. So that initiative has not been particularly successful.
Yeah. And so what advice do you have both to Biden, Walensky, Fauci, individuals, employers? I mean, there's different advice and we're trying to focus not as much on the individual, but I guess just for people watching, like, what do you recommend that people can do? How long should they isolate for? And then we can talk about making the capitalists actually pay for it. But just in terms of like right now, before the revolution, what should people be doing?
So I think about this in two ways. One way is that there's, as the Biden administration was pushing before recently, this line, we have the tools. Not everyone has the tools. Yeah. But if you have the tools being control over who you live with and their activities and control over your working environment and money to buy things, you should get vaccinated. You should get boosted if you haven't been. You should be wearing high quality masks, better than a surgical or fabric mask, but N95 or similar. If you get exposed or isolated, I would follow the older 10-day guidance, and also potentially consider using rapid at-home tests and testing negative before you leave isolation. But again, not everyone has that luxury.
Yeah, I agree with Justin. And just in terms of what the Biden administration needs to do, they need to be much bolder in what they're doing. The 500 million rapid tests that are promised for like January, like we're in the middle of the surge now, that needs to be like billions of rapid tests. They should be sending out masks, N95 masks, or at least supporting states and be able to send these out. Connecticut actually is doing this. To all Americans. Much of the plan that they have is like around building hospital capacity, but that's like too late. We actually need to do things that slow transmission, creating data-driven policy guidance around mask policies. Like there's, standards around ventilation and air filtration. There's like a lot that they, even the domestic air travel, getting vaccination requirements for that. There are a lot of things that they could be doing that they're not doing. And so, I would like to see that happen.
Yeah. It seems like they planned for the best case scenario, which was, they came into office during a major wave and they figured it would kind of go down to ignorable levels. And that didn't happen with Delta and then Omicron. And the decisions they've made have just made it even difficult for them to take another path. So we're going full speed ahead into a wave of infection. And I would just say to them, among other things, first, fire Jeff Zients and put in charge someone who knows what they're doing and can manage a pandemic with fewer people dying. And also hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Plan for this getting worse. Plan for it staying another year or two or more. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but you need the policy infrastructure to be able to deal with it if it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they should put in, I'm echoing, I think. I'm gonna actually stop talking.
Oh, no,
I feel like I hear myself echoing. Am I echoing?
On you? Let me see. Let me mute.
Okay. Okay, I'm not echoing anymore. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yes.
No, just to Justin's point, like they should put in someone leading the response who has a public health as well as health equity background. That would be really awesome to have that, as opposed to someone with a finance background.
Right. That's absurd. That's kind of obscene. I didn't even realize that. I don't know if I forgot it. It's like a repressed memory, or I never knew it. But Bain, are you kidding me? You can't make that up. And here's another question from the audience. It's a kind of large one, so tackle it in a limited extent. Ask us to discuss poor med/public health communication strategies used, how vaccine hesitancy and medical distrust is historical and political. Really easy ones.
That's like a big topic.
Yeah. Anything that you want to say about this? I was going to say, Justin, I know in your piece at Jacobin, you write about historical.
Yeah. I mean, I would think about this in a few different ways. But from the beginning in the U.S., a lot of both media and Biden administration were claiming that people who weren't vaccinated didn't want to be and were ideologically opposed. And what that framing does is take away the responsibility of government and put it all on the people. Yeah. It's true that a lot of people don't want to be vaccinated, and that's a real problem that needs to we have to figure out ways of dealing with that. But since that line back in May of pandemic of the unvaccinated, tens of millions of people have been newly vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And you can think about Republicans who don't want to get vaccinated because they, whatever reasons they give. But I also think about people who are in prisons and jails and don't trust the medical system there. I think about the workers in meatpacking plants that have really high rates of infection, where in some cases, extreme cases, we had managers of those plants placing bets on how many would be infected, not trusting worksite vaccination. That's completely understandable because it's happening in the context of these really unequal power relations. Children have very low vaccination rates. Children under 5 aren't vaccinated. And I'm also seeing a pattern where people in their 80s and late 70s have lower vaccination rates than people in their 60s and early 70s. And to me, that's just about autonomy and who can make decisions about their healthcare versus who needs to rely on others. So we really still need a lot more outreach and a lot more, working with institutions, with community groups, et cetera, to get the vaccine out.
Yeah. And just to add, like, a lot of the focus, because I'm in particular, I've done a lot of, I have a whole career as like a researcher, and so did a lot of work around mistrust and in the context of HIV. Right. But just to say that, so much of the focus was on like the mistrust of individuals and of communities, as opposed to like, what do institutions need to do to build trust? Like, it should be like flipped around, right. Institutional trustworthiness, like, because so many different communities have been mistreated, neglected, and have very valid and justifiable reasons like to be concerned about this vaccines that were developed rather quickly, and so I think there's just a lot more like, for instance, with the CDC, in terms of the messaging that happens. How do we tailor messaging to like rural white folks who may have mistrust for different reasons than maybe Black and Latino people in New York City? And we're not really seeing any of that happening.
Right. Yeah. And the narrative is all about it being a bunch of people who are anti-vaxxers because they don't have to look at the ways that people have to face different barriers. Like you can't find childcare necessarily to go get vaccinated, right?
Right. And just an overall, like thinking about, for instance, we don't even have healthcare for all in this country. Like, so people have been neglected, mistreated, not cared for, and then you're now saying, oh, I have this vaccine and I need you to take it. Like it's inconsistent. It doesn't align. It doesn't make sense with people's experiences.
Right. And they're also wary of hidden fees or hidden bills, right? Which happens a lot in healthcare.
And honestly, and I see patients at one of our city hospitals, and I had 2 patients come in the other day who have not been vaccinated. No one ever talked to them about vaccination. What do they have in common? They're both homeless. One has serious mental illness. Like, there are lots of folks that like society has discarded, and no one's making many efforts to protect them. So it's a complicated and heterogeneous picture.
Yeah, and also given that those are things that you can actually doesn't require like reconversion, right? I mean, if you have people who are really ideologically anti-vaccine, like that's the sexy population to vilify. In the meantime, you're ignoring all these people who need access, need resources, who you could actually empower to get vaccinated, who would if they could, or if they knew more about it.
Exactly.
Well, I know, Dr. Blackstock, you have to leave. No, thank you so much for joining. I don't know what your schedule. So I'll just do Justin, if you have a few more minutes, would love to keep going. But if you have to go.
Sure. Yeah, I'm okay to keep going a little bit.
Okay, awesome. Dr. Blackstock, thank you so much for joining. Everyone follow her on Twitter and check out her amazing organization, Health Justice. And thank you so much for all that you do. And maybe one day you can come on with your twin sister.
Oh, yeah.
Also a doctor.
We'd be happy to. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks,
Bradley. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. That was great. Great guests.
Yeah.
Really great. Great discussion. Just a quick reminder, guys, like the stream and share the stream. And of course, join or do whatever you want, but definitely subscribe. And these are just all ways that you can share the word, spread the word on the show. And unlike, joining Patreon, which of course I invite you to do, it doesn't cost you anything. So encourage you to do that. Okay. So Justin, let's see. What do you want to talk about?
I don't know.
No, I have a lot. I was being facetious, although it's not inconceivable for me to say, especially given how I started off this particular episode. But I thought that your piece was, your Jacobin piece was so interesting because you talk about how there's this conscious choice, I guess, to blame the individual versus blaming like the business owner. And you start your piece talking about where is it, in which town in England?
Yeah, so I start out talking about the history of quarantine and these early infectious disease epidemics that hit Europe. So this was early on in capitalism in the early 19th century. And people who were scientists at the time, who were aligned with business interests, did not want to believe that diseases spread from person to person. And they were opposed to practices like keeping ships out in a harbor for 40 days. That's where the word quarantine comes from, or what was called cordon sanitaire, blocking, from the word 40 in Italian. Cordon sanitaire, which is like what we'd call travel restrictions now, because they wanted commerce to flow freely. And some of them were liberals, capitalist liberals, and did have genuine concerns about the working class and thought that if the economy tanked, they would be hurting the working class. So very early on, you had public health pit against the economy. However, some of these people who were opposed to quarantine, one of them was Edwin Chadwick, who wrote the Poor Laws in England, and they were the kind of very punitive welfare laws. So you had to, if you weren't employed, you had to go work in terrible conditions and get like a little bit of food. But throughout the history of public health, you have this sort of what we call now, some people call now individualization of responsibility, where it's not on the state, it's not on corporations, it's on the individual. You can see it in climate change and lots of environmental type of debates around it's not about policy, it's around you're
Carbon
reducing your
footprint.
carbon. Yeah, and BP, the oil company, invented the idea of the carbon footprint. So same thing, you've had many decades at least in its current form in public health, this idea that to be healthy, you need to exercise and eat right and do all the right things and go to the doctor at the right times, which are all good things to do, but that doesn't really explain how systems make us sick, how pollution from industry can make us sick. It doesn't, it doesn't speak to the distribution of wealth, which can determine how long we live. And not even to mention the fact that so many people either don't have health insurance in the US or have very low quality health insurance.
Yeah. And what are you working on now? What research are you doing?
So I have a bunch of different projects going right now. Some of my research is looking at the unequal toll of the current pandemic. So I spoke a bit about it, a study I did earlier, which looked at race in combination with economic position and just showing these astounding inequalities in the first year in the pandemic, where you see, again, the lower income people of color just dying at extraordinarily high rates. And I'm kind of updating that as new data becomes available for 2021. And just the death rates of indigenous people in the US, so American Indian, Alaska Native, and Pacific Islanders in the US are astronomical. And you can, even if you were to forgive much of Biden's response to the pandemic, you could say his hands have been tied. He couldn't have done better. It's, to me, completely unforgivable that you have indigenous people in the US just being decimated. You can think about indigenous...
Kind of on brand for the US.
You can think of indigenous elders who have cultural knowledge about language, about ecosystems, about traditions, that when these knowledge systems die, when these people die, and you could do a targeted deployment of resources much better than what we've seen to stop this. Samoan people in the US, I've estimated that 10% of Samoan elders 65 or older have died in the pandemic so far. It's just astounding, and the inequalities have continued this entire time.
And why is that?
It's a combination of various factors. So you can really break it down into three broad categories. So one is who is being exposed, and that is has a lot to do with workplace and housing. And for instance, some of the highest death rates early in the pandemic were Marshall Islanders living in Arkansas who were working in meatpacking plants and just died in incredibly large numbers. Another has to do with access to healthcare and quality of healthcare. So if you delay care because you don't have a regular physician, are uninsured, don't feel comfortable going to a hospital, you then arrive later in the course of illness, if you arrive at all, and it's harder to intervene. And then you can think about prior health conditions. So social inequality has been linked to poor health forever since we have data. And you have, if you're thinking about indigenous people in virtually every country in the world, despite not being genetically related, live shorter lives than settlers, majorities in those countries. And that has to do with just the processes of colonization and the resources and power that takes away from people and upsetting their ways of making a living and sustaining their health. And that's true in the US, true in many other countries as well.
Kate asks, please ask your guests if they have seen or foresee any government push to improving general health re-COVID? No PSAs re BMI, vitamins, or mental health.
Yeah, I mean, I think what a government push would look like can look in many different ways. And yeah, so PSAs generally don't work. Putting out information may improve the health of people who already have access to resources, but it doesn't change their housing conditions or their working conditions, for example. It doesn't bring, fresh foods into their supermarkets if they can even afford to shop there. Will we invest more in public health systems and healthcare after this and building, universal healthcare or single payer healthcare? Will this spur those things? I think that remains to be seen. It's up to us as citizens, as people engaged in politics, to make that happen. But I'm kind of pessimistic and pretty alarmed that we've been seeing this erosion of health and decrease in life expectancy actually for years in the US, due to many different factors. Part of it's the opioid crisis. Part of it is, people just not getting by economically, high rates of suicide, high rates of people not surviving from cancers. So we were going in a pretty poor direction before this. And that's something with deep economic and political roots. And we've just seen this even greater erosion of health from working class people and people of color. And until pretty recently, there wasn't that much outrage about it. I don't think, not the kind of outrage that I would hope for. And as we go into climate change and its health effects, I am worried that we're going to see the same sorts of response to all the various crises that arise from climate change. Things like new infectious diseases, as mosquitoes, for instance, come further north. People dying in hurricanes and flooding and of heat stress on the job, for instance.
Yeah, which we're already seeing. Which I am always amazed by, like how much reporting there is about the weather and how little connection there's made between the weather and climate change.
Yeah.
And wanted you to respond to one more thing, if you have the time.
Sure.
Look towards federal solutions.
All right, so this is Biden addressing a bunch of governors, and I think this is Asa Hutchinson, just some Republican governor asking him something.
As you look towards federal solutions that will help alleviate the challenge, make sure that we do not let federal solutions stand in the way of state solutions. And the production of 500 million rapid tests that will be distributed by the federal government is great, but obviously that dries up the supply chain for the solutions that we might offer as governor. And so just that brief comment before I turn it over to you, Mr. President.
I said, thank you very much, Ace. Look, there is no federal solution. This gets solved at a state level. I'm looking at Governor Sununu on the board here. He talks about that a lot. And it ultimately gets down to where the rubber meets the road, and that's where the patient is in need of help or preventing the need for help. We just have to stay focused and continue to work together. My message to the governor is simple. If you need something, say something. And we're going to have your back in any way we can.
So what do you say to that? There are no federal solutions.
Yeah, I mean, so actually, Asa Hutchinson, who I think is the governor of Arkansas, right?
Yeah.
He was interviewed on NPR after this, and the thing he said he asked for, and a bunch of governors asked for, was the 5-day isolation revision.
There you go.
So yeah, that's the kind of thing he's providing to states. So I think he's kind of given up on, or even worse than given up. He's actually, Jeff Zients has dissuaded states from doing things like bringing back mask mandates. This whole pandemic, we've seen just the devolution of responsibility. The federal government says it's the state governments. The state government says it's the local government. The local government says, oh, every individual school district and company and church and nonprofit organization, they have to figure out how to manage it for themselves. And then you just get chaos. It is true that we have this federal system in the US that can make it difficult to coordinate. And we have these political divides. So it was never going to be easy. But I would just look at countries like Canada, which also has a federal system, where some of their premiers are very right-wing. You have Doug Ford in Ontario, who was for a long time a Trump supporter. He's taken a much more precautionary approach to the pandemic than virtually any governor, Democrat or Republican, in the US. So there are fundamental problems that are happening at the federal level in the US that cannot solely be explained away by our political particularities.
And any suggestions for Biden in terms of what federal things he could do?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest things to do are to just ramp up production of the things we need to keep people safe. So he dropped the ball on rapid tests. You can use, hopefully he's ramping up production of that. Now you can use the Defense Production Act to do that. You can distribute masks to people and also suggest that people wear actual high quality masks. The CDC website right now, especially if you just skim it casually, the top kind of masks they suggest are made of cloth. And those masks, it's not that they don't work completely, but they're much weaker than an N95 or a KN95 or a KF94. These are other masks that work a lot better. Again, without even having to go to Congress, you could do things like come up with a certification program for ventilation systems. You have businesses and churches, et cetera, schools trying to buy ventilation equipment, not knowing what they're doing, getting ripped off, sometimes getting equipment that produces ozone that makes it unhealthy to breathe. It's just been the most basic of things they've dropped the ball on that wouldn't even engender that much political resistance. And then they really do need to go to Congress, and they do need to have a longer term plan. I have my wish list of things. I don't know which ones are possible in the short versus the long term, but you need to come up with a solution for immunocompromised people who are not going to be protected by the vaccine. It's a small percent of the population, but it potentially is many hundreds of thousands or more people. You need to give them compensation so they can do different jobs, change their living situations, et cetera. And there are just many issues like that. We need a new system, a new regulatory framework, and a permanent expansion of the welfare state so that working class people and disabled people and people of color aren't paying for the pandemic with their lives and don't continue to pay for COVID, even after we no longer call it a pandemic, when people will continue to die in the tens of thousands or more each year. And we don't want to normalize that.
Amen to that. So someone said in the chat, and I want to ask you, because it's somewhat related to the question about like BMI, but someone said, why not emphasize, where is this? Here. Why not promote immune health? And then many question marks. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll speak to, I think, the underlying issue that points to. So there are some people who say, okay, what the government should be doing, or maybe what public health officials should be doing, is talking to the public, having them improve their underlying health so they can survive this condition, this infection if they get it. And I think it's probably a good sentiment. You want people to survive, of course, and you want them to be in a position where they can do that. Some people have health conditions that can't change, can't improve for biological reasons. If you have certain immune conditions, you can't improve them. For social reasons, maybe you live in poverty and it's not easy for you to do the things you would need to do to improve your underlying health. And yeah, there's also this also very quickly veers into kind of crackpot territory. Like a lot of people say, like, oh, it's all about vitamin D. Just have your vitamin D and supplement. There's very little evidence that vitamin D supplements will actually help things. It probably won't hurt if you're having it at a non-toxic level, but a lot of this nutrition research is of very poor quality, and you can't trust it.
Yeah. It also does put the emphasis again on kind of individual choice.
Exactly.
And I'm always reminded of like when Eric Garner was killed and they were like, oh, he was, out of shape.
Yeah. So this is actually where the two main things I've been studying intersect. I study police violence, and I study recently the COVID pandemic. Eric Garner, the defense for Derek Chauvin in the Eric Garner trial
Pantaleo. Well, Eric Garner was Pantaleo.
Oh, sorry.
Chauvin was
confusing for George Floyd.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
But it applies to both.
It applies to both, and it applies to many cases of deaths in police custody. So I'm thinking about the Chauvin trial where George Floyd had been infected with COVID. He also had fentanyl in his bloodstream. He also had other underlying health conditions. So what the defense did for Chauvin was to try to cast doubt on this idea that it was the knee on Floyd's neck that actually killed him. They said essentially he would have died the same way at the same time anyway. And you see this in a lot of deaths in police custody. And how I would connect it to COVID is it's this victim blaming that's going on. And it's really unfortunate. And what it's meant to do is to take the blame away from government and from institutions and onto individuals. And there's this underlying issue of ableism. So if you're a person who can't survive a knee on your neck or a COVID infection, then maybe you don't deserve to live. That's what's implied here to me.
Yeah. A lot of people point out that obesity is a big comorbidity, and we need to be talking about that more.
Yeah. So there's people out there who really like to talk about obesity in COVID deaths. It's true. There is research that says with increasing levels of obesity, if you medicalize it that way, there's higher risk. One, there's many other health conditions that also applies to: diabetes, immunocompromised conditions, people who have survived and recovered from cancer, people with mental illness. There's a whole range. So I think why people immediately go to obesity is because there's this societal anti-fat bias, and it's also kind of a way of saying they brought it upon themselves because they were living their lives in a way that made them unworthy to be alive. And I also don't think that BMI explains these massive racial and economic inequalities, because the patterns just don't line up in the same way. And differences in BMI by race are relatively small compared to differences in who's dying of COVID by race, which are enormous.
That's interesting. I'm just during your last minutes here, I'm just adding your Twitter handle so people can. Or I'm about to sneeze. I really should have muted myself for that one. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of discussion about that, and some kind of, people are really into that, and I'm not really sure why, even if you think those things are important, why you wouldn't also want the government to be, if you talk about that stuff, then I hope you're talking about Medicare for all, or vaccines across the globe, or else there's, I think, a weird prioritization going on. Anything else that you want to share? I mean, you know a lot about this subject. So anything else that you feel like people aren't learning about, aren't talking about?
I mean, the way I would like tie that all together is this idea of social Darwinism, which people used to proudly proclaim they were social Darwinists back in the day, if this were 100 years ago. And that's just the idea that like if people are fit mentally and physically, they will be the ones to survive. And if you're not fit mentally and physically, if you die, you've thinned yourself out of the population. Your life didn't have value. Right. And that's how I tie together these centrist liberals with right-wing anti-vaxxers. Right-wing anti-vaxxers are often framing things in terms of like, oh, I can survive this. Why would I need medical care if I'm not sick? Because anti-vaxxers rarely will refuse to go to the hospital. They'll rarely refuse monoclonal antibodies. It's really because they think like if they are fit and worthy, they're going to survive this virus. And then I would talk about the centrist liberals who take pleasure in the deaths of unvaccinated people. And I think there's a similar sentiment there. These people in their mind were mentally unfit because they had these viewpoints and values that just make their lives unvaluable. And I would reject all of that. And I would say we need to think about a class analysis here. We need to understand who is benefiting by us not controlling the pandemic. And who's benefiting right now is like major corporations who don't want their profits to be infringed upon by public health measures.
Yeah. There are people who are on the left, identify as being on the left, who are anti-vaccine. And that's another interesting, population or, well, I don't want to sound like an epidemiologist, but another interesting, I don't know how much those things, I think that there's a different type of thinking there, right? There's kind of like some well-founded skepticism of big pharma. But what's your response to people who think that, some of whom are in this chat?
Oh yeah, totally. And I'd love to engage more with some of those people, because like I haven't really talked that much to people who identify as being on the left and are opposed to vaccines. But what I've come across is this. I think I agree with them in part. Like you said, you should be skeptical of big pharma, and you should be skeptical of governments. But you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like there is a class analysis and an analysis of vaccination under capitalism that leads you to think vaccines are actually really great. And I think it goes like this. The wealthiest people in the world and the people who have the most power in the world were the first ones in line to get the vaccine.
Right.
And they are also the ones who are hoarding these vaccines so people in colonized countries and exploited countries around the world don't get it. That's the direction I would point them. And there are thousands and thousands of scientists who are independent-minded and skeptical like me out there, and we're reviewing the data. There is actually a pretty good regulatory system for vaccination. It's not perfect. No system is perfect. But one thing it does is makes a lot of data publicly available, so all the scientists out there in the world can scrutinize it. And some of these scientists, unfortunately, are crackpots. And a very small number, just like a small number of climatologists say climate change isn't happening or isn't caused by humans, a very small number of scientists in public health or medicine will claim that vaccines are harmful. And a lot of them are just they're grifters. They're trying to get attention. Some of them end up getting a lot of money. Some of the, these groups around, like Doctors for America, who are selling ivermectin treatment, like making money off appointments. They're grifting. You can't trust them. You have to look at what are the conventional opinions within independent public health experts. And you can even just look at those with left values. Like if you're on the political left, there are plenty of us who are socialists or other kinds of leftists who are on the political left, who are skeptical, but who know that vaccines are the best thing we can do to protect ourselves as individuals. But we don't think they're enough to protect whole societies. We think there needs to be other policies also.
Yeah. And someone asked about, sorry, one second. Someone pointed out China has had less than 10,000 deaths and the USA has had close to 1 million. Then someone asked about a case, hold on. The use of ivermectin in Uttar Pradesh and the success they achieved until the U.S. tried to force them to stop. I don't know if that's something you...
Yeah, so I don't know that particular story. There's no conspiracy to withhold ivermectin treatment. A lot of different drugs were tried out to treat people who are already infected throughout the course of the pandemic. And we've found a couple so far. One is a monoclonal antibody that continues to hold up with Omicron, and another is Plaxa. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's a newer drug by Pfizer. Those work. Early on, there were, similar to ivermectin now, early on there was this sort of conspiracy theorizing around an anti-malarial drug, hydroxychloroquine. It turned out to not be effective. So many of these drugs have been tested, and you can have promising results in an early, low-quality study, but then when they're brought to the next level and a more rigorous study, then they don't hold up all the time. We do thankfully have a couple medications that do hold up. And what was the other question? I'm already forgetting.
I don't know. Was another someone?
China. It wasn't really.
Oh yeah, someone pointed out China,
Yeah,
and then
okay, now Japan. Okay.
Yeah, tell us about Japan, their current case.
Yeah, so I think this is something that I wish I'd mentioned even earlier. Different countries have had very different approaches to pandemic response. Among wealthy nations in the world, the U.S. has been among the worst. UK is also very bad. I think there are some countries that have done worse in terms of deaths than us. I think Brazil is one of them, some Central European countries also. So countries like China or South Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, they all have somewhat different approaches. But what they've been able to, through a combination of travel restrictions, so restricting how many people come in and screening everyone, and sometimes putting them up in hotels for a long time. That's part of it. Shutting businesses when they need to be shut down temporarily and opening them back up and supporting people. That's basically how they've been keeping up. Even Canada, I think Canada is the most interesting comparator to the US. So this entire pandemic, Canada has had less than half the death rate from COVID as the United States. And they did travel restrictions and screenings at various points. And they, even in right-wing provinces, they shut things down and are continuing to shut things down as needed. They'll open them back up when rates get better. So it just shows that even in a country fairly similar to ours, you can do much better. And it didn't have to be this way.
So if you were the president of the United States, what would you do?
How much power do I have?
Let's say we can do it like magical president.
Okay.
Like all the power.
Yeah.
Dictator. Let's say you were the king of the United States.
Sure. I mean, the very short term is...
Heard of the philosopher king? Now we're talking about the epidemiologist king. All right.
The very short term, we need to shut down non-essential businesses, send those people home, pay them generously. We need to shift. There's so many people who are doing office work that can easily be remote. that can easily shift into people's homes. Pay people extra because now, they're using more electricity, for example. For the people who need to be in the remaining workforce, who are growing our food and staffing our grocery stores and working in hospitals, one, they'll benefit because there's just less COVID going around to society. But you need to do things in the immediate term, like using rapid testing of everyone, paid quarantine and isolation, high quality masks. All that can decrease risk for them. And then when rates go down, you can open up back more again. In the meantime, over the next months and years, we need to be building long-term policies that can deal with the worst possible scenarios, but that also understand that in a scenario where there potentially are many deaths each year, many of those will be avoidable. So we can improve occupational health and safety regulation. We can have really good data about, just like, we can see if a storm is coming and cancel school for that period, or, have workers not come in, or have them bring their umbrella. You can see if the COVID wave is coming. So you have people wear their high quality mask or shift to remote work or whatever it is. We need to be protecting workers from infectious disease better. And we need to be protecting disabled and immunocompromised workers by training them for other fields, allowing them to work from home under the Americans with Disabilities Act, expand that to include household members who might bring diseases home to people they live with who have high-risk conditions. There's a whole set of policies that could be considered to build a long-term response, because we don't want this to be a leading cause of death for years and decades to come. And there's no telling that it's just going to go away. You had a lot of experts out there. That's another thing we could talk about, is the experts that have been pushing the White House to the right on COVID. But a lot of experts out there were saying, okay, COVID's basically going to go down to 40 or 50,000 deaths a year. We have that from flu. That's acceptable. So we just don't really need to do anything else. And it's not inevitable that it's going to go down that low unless we actually do something about it.
Right. And did you mention the OSHA decision? Did you bring that up earlier? I saw you tweet about it.
Yeah. So there's a bunch to talk about with OSHA. What I did mention was an early attempt by the Biden administration to regulate workplaces in March, pursued in March, but ultimately they didn't go with it. The White House killed it by May. They did regulate occupational health and safety for COVID risk for healthcare workers only. And that was in effect until a few days ago, when they decided to stop enforcing it. It had gone into a legal gray area, but people who worked in high level positions with OSHA said that they could continue to try to enforce it. They decided not to continue to try to enforce it. And that rule did things like masking regulations, paid quarantine and isolation, paid testing, ventilation requirements. So none of that is in effect anymore. And then there's the latest, which is a vaccine or test mandate, and that would apply to workplaces with 100 or more workers. That has gone through the courts. One court rejected it on very spurious grounds. Another court upheld it. And then more recently, the Supreme Court said that they would review it in early January. So that will determine whether or not workers for large organizations have to either get vaccinated or do weekly testing. And I think if they do the weekly testing, they have to wear masks as well. So that may or may not happen. We will see.
And final question is, oh man, what is it? Just went out of my head. You may have lucked out. I think I can't. I can't remember what it was. Oh, and of course you'd have to include in that a global plan to vaccinate.
Oh yeah. So I didn't even get there. I'm a little too US minded. There was a plan before a vaccine had even been developed by governments of the global south, led by Costa Rica, to not just open up the patents for the vaccines, but also have US and other global north governments do what's called technology transfer. So literally sending engineers down to help countries like Costa Rica and Brazil and India manufacture vaccines. And that didn't happen. And that, I think that is, of all the crimes against humanity we've witnessed over the last couple of years, I think that's probably the top one. Because we're seeing millions of deaths that would have been preventable just if they had only done this. And then you have people who are either from industry or closely tied to industry groups coming out in media saying early on, these poor countries, they don't know how to make mRNA vaccines. It's too complicated for them. Meanwhile, you have New York Times and more recently some nonprofit organizations looking for potential mRNA vaccine manufacturers in the global south, and they found over 100. And some of them are working on efforts to develop their own mRNA vaccines. And so they're just kind of sitting around testing away when they could be just manufacturing the ones that already exist and saving people's lives.
Yeah. And of course, there's Cuba.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So Cuba is just like a beacon of hope to me.
Yeah.
They developed a couple of effective vaccines. I don't think there's data on how well they hold up against Omicron, but probably they hold up at least against hospitalization and death. And they have really invested in their biotech sector over the decades, and they
also
have
invented the meningitis vaccine.
Yeah, and they have a vaccine that's in trials that would potentially treat lung cancer, and yeah, just really shows what a small country, if they prioritize their investments well to social good rather than profit, can really achieve a lot. But it also shows how it really takes a lot of time. Like they have decades and decades of experience and collaboration earlier with the Soviet Union. Like you can't. I think there's a reason why Cuba has been so much more successful than China at producing a bunch of different vaccines. Even though China has central planning and a lot of scientists, you just have so much expertise historically in Cuba that you just can't replicate.
Right. Well, partly because they believe in preemptive medicine so much, right?
Yeah, they have an incredible public health system that has been a model for the world. And I know that personally, early on when we were being advised not to wear masks in the US, what I was seeing was in early April, Cuba was starting to distribute fabric to its factories and instructing its citizens to make cloth masks at home. And that's when I knew, like, here's a country with the most experience in the world in infectious disease. And if they're doing this, we're making a big mistake. And then, of course, a couple of weeks later, there was a reversal, of course, in the US. And they started recommending masks.
And one other thing is, a lot of people in the chat, but just in generally, and I'm guilty of this too, for whatever reason, I've kind of internalized this idea that like, Omicron, not that big of a deal. I mean, I'm being very careful. But there is, what's the deal with Omicron?
Okay.
Is it much less deadly?
This is really important, and we probably should have talked about it earlier. So we keep hearing it's mild, it's okay, and it's especially okay if you're vaccinated, and especially okay if you have a booster. There's some truth to that, but it's more complicated to that. On an individual level, the best data we have right now, and that's still evolving, is that any one person who's infected is less likely to go to the hospital and less likely to die than they would have been from Delta. Delta was pretty bad in terms of severity. On the population level, so many more people are being infected that you're going to have a lot of deaths. So I would say it's more severe to societies, less severe to individuals. And if you're young and you don't have high risk conditions and you're not immunocompromised and you have a vaccination, And especially if you have a booster, it's pretty unlikely you're going to end up in a hospital. But if you're older or you have these high-risk conditions, even if you're vaccinated, your vaccination is decreasing your risk. No doubt about that. But you can't take it for granted. The vaccines cut your risk by maybe 90%, maybe 95% of going to the hospital. But there's still a lot of people who are vaccinated who are going to the hospital and dying just because so many vaccinated people are old, have high-risk conditions, are unlucky.
Right. And another thing is that, so it's kind of like collectively as dangerous. Is that, I mean, I don't even know.
I would say collectively it's more dangerous than Delta was, because especially given that we're not doing anything to prevent transmission. The set of policies in place in the US right now has set us on a course where they're going to allow nearly everyone to be infected. Maybe not everyone. Maybe it'll go down to low levels with merely a very large percent of the population being infected. And each time that happens, each time it affects someone new, that's a risk of that person having a bad outcome. Even if it's low risk for any one person, it's high risk in the aggregate. So in New York City, where I'm following the data most closely, the hospitalization rate right now is as high as it's been, is higher than it's been since March, when few people were vaccinated, and it continues to go up. And I think people who have been, let's say you're high risk, let's say you're immunocompromised, let's say you're older, and you've been able to take a lot of precautions up to now and avoid getting infected. A lot of those people are going to end up infected for the first time. And it's not going to go well for all of them. And I think about all these people in nursing homes. Many of them have 2 doses. Half of them, last I checked, have boosters. So if you're unboosted in a nursing home, like I worry about that too.
Mm-hmm. And what about a lot of people talk about natural immunity? Like it's better to get it.
Yeah, definitely not better to get it. I wouldn't call it natural immunity. I would call it immunity by infection. So there's immunity by infection and there's immunity by vaccination. So immunity by infection is bad for 2 reasons. One, it means you were infected, which means there was a risk to your health. And there's potentially long-term, even if you don't end up in the hospital, there's potentially long-term consequences to your health of getting infected. 2, it's less stable. You don't know, a lot of people who got infected will end up being immune, but you don't know if you're one of them.
Right.
The vaccine is very uniform in the kind of protection it provides. And then there's a question of variants. Maybe you were infected by the first strain. Maybe you were infected by Alpha. Maybe you were infected by Delta. Maybe you're infected by Omicron. Some variants don't protect against others. So if you were infected by Delta, let's say in November, you don't have very good protection against Omicron. You probably have some protection against hospitalization, but you're really, maybe you have some subtle lung damage, maybe you have some subtle brain damage, neurological damage. You may not even realize it, but it's affecting people's ability to focus and their cognition. And when you lose your sense of smell, there's potentially more going on than that, for instance.
Yeah.
So I'm worried about people who are going to get reinfected, especially one very close to the other. I have a friend who got infected very early on, March 2020, just got infected now, and had some long-term issues from the first infection. And that's not a situation you want people to be in.
Right. And then people make a lot of the fact that you can transmit it when you're vaccinated.
Yeah.
As kind of an argument against some people will say, well, the only person I'm hurting, and they don't believe that they're hurting themselves anyway, but they are like, I'm not hurting other people because if I'm not vaccinated, I'm no more infectious than someone who is vaccinated.
Yeah. So one, they've been making that argument a long time. There was a point in time until recently when vaccination provided pretty strong protection against transmission. That kind of degraded over time, especially with Delta. Now with Omicron, there is some level of protection. For instance, it seems like the best evidence we have suggests that it shortens the amount of time you're infectious for. That means a vaccinated person, on average, is going to infect fewer people than an unvaccinated person. And, and there's other reasons why we should care. Like if you end up in a hospital, you're taking up a bed that could be going to someone else. You're exhausting a healthcare worker who could be, taking a break and not wanting to, leave the healthcare field.
Right. All right. Awesome. And yes, so and Justin has all of this. He actually researches this, so less people are like, "Where's the data?" I'm sure you can point people to the data.
We'd be happy to.
And of course, you're gonna get called a shill by some people, but I don't know who you're shilling for. Someone writes, "Lock me up, daddy. Put me on the booster treadmill." I mean, I had another doctor on here who was like, "That's part of the reason they don't want to immunize the whole world, because they want to be able to keep giving the boosters." And I don't know. I wouldn't say that's not inconceivable, but it means get your booster. Like, even if you're going to say that that's happening by that logic, then get the booster.
Yeah. I mean, it's the logic is a logic of false scarcity. So we're using all these vaccine doses to give people boosters when they could be going to the global south.
Right.
In a world where the global south isn't producing their own vaccines. So we need the whole world to be producing vaccines. And if people need boosters, they need boosters. Hopefully we get to a point where, there continues to be a lot of research on this and new kinds of vaccines available. And hopefully we get to a point where you don't need a booster or you only need one every few years.
Yeah. And when is this going to settle down? Like what does this become less? Does the virus become more like, I've heard this too, it becomes more less deadly and more common? What's that trajectory?
So there's a myth that's common that we've been hearing over the last almost 2 years, that viruses just naturally tend to mutate in a way, evolve in a way that they're less severe when they infect humans. That is not true, unfortunately. I wish it were true. They basically evolve at random, and they'll succeed if they're more transmissible. But the transmissibility doesn't necessarily have anything to do with how severe it is. I think what might happen is, and what the powers that be are hoping happens, is that a large number of people get infected in the next few weeks in the US, and then we are immune to Omicron for a while, and then it'll be circulating, but at lower levels that we can just ignore and go on about our lives. That's an extremely dangerous way to proceed. That's one scenario. There are other scenarios where it gets worse, where it continues to be the same. There do seem to be seasonal patterns, different regions affected in different seasons at different times. So I was much more comfortable going out in the world this summer than I was when Delta hit and then winter hit and then Omicron hit. Like it's waxed and waned over time.
Yeah, we really got to take advantage of the next time it's warm.
Yeah.
Okay, and then last question. Seth Jones asks, what should those of us do to protect ourselves in states where the government and population are not taking it seriously?
Yeah. So not everyone, again, I've said this before, not everyone will have the power to or resources or wealth to follow the advice I'm about to give. But I would avoid indoor social contact as much as possible, especially with people who are not in your household, or at least reduce the number of people you have indoor social contact with. I would wear a high quality N95 or similar mask that fits well when you're going into indoor spaces where you're going to be interacting with people. There's this great guy on YouTube, The Mask Nerd, if you want to get really into it. He reviews all the masks, has a bunch of fancy equipment to do it. And if you're going to have unmasked social contacts, I'll tell you a story. I'm in Rhode Island. I'm in Providence right now. I was visiting my sister in Brooklyn, or was planning to, last week. And I came with rapid tests. Again, not everyone can afford or even find rapid tests. But I gave them rapid tests. They were positive. I immediately left. I knew I was taking a risk. So yeah, the way I would process this psychologically is, it's very bad right now. I'm going to be able to do more things in the near future, but not right now. What I personally did was I saw how cases were going. The booster was doing very well under Delta, and I was not even afraid of infection. So I was going out a bit. So I saw Omicron rising. I had my final meal in a restaurant, and I'm I'm not going to go to restaurants for a while. I'm just going to wait and see what happens.
Yeah. Wow. All right. It's all so depressing, but things will get better as long as the government does something helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I was interviewed about this almost a year ago now. So I said, basically the way it goes is we could end up doing better, and it'll happen for one of two reasons. Either we get lucky or we have a good policy response. Well, unfortunately, since then, we weren't lucky and we had a bad policy response.
Right. All right. Well, okay. This was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, really good to talk to you.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to put this into a bunch of clips and turn it into podcasts.
Awesome.
And thank you for all that you do.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. And happy to connect to your audience here.
Thanks.
All right, take care.
Bye. All right, guys. Well, there's some of you that are out there and loud and critical, and then there's some of you who are appreciative and loud, and I don't know, guys. A lot of people out there who like China, but then they're anti-vax. I don't know how do you reconcile those things. I love how niche my audience is, that's like an actual major population that watches the show, but it's true. And then also pro-Cuba, but anti-vax. So I don't know how you're going to reconcile that. But thank you for those of you who say you love me anyway. Yeah, this has been great. Thanks for the misinformation. Oh my God, some of you guys are so annoying. Some of you are really annoying. But what are you going to do? I love you anyway. I love you anyway. I love most of you anyway. Some of you are really annoying though. And yeah, stay safe. And yeah, let's try to, the big challenge here is for me, as someone who believes that the vaccine and the booster should be taken, it's like I don't want to. I'd like it if the CDC acted in a more responsible way, because I just think that it just gives fodder to people who I think are mistaken on this. So, and I'm sure if I do a video that's like doctors critique Fauci or doctors critique the CDC, it'll get taken down or something. But yeah, I got the booster. I already got the booster. People are saying, don't get the booster, Katie. I got the booster. And it kicked my ass, and I'm very glad that I got the booster. It kicked my ass because I have a very strong immune system, obviously, but it really did kick my ass. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. That's some people anti-mandate, not anti-vax. I don't even know what the mandate looks like. We haven't really had one. So, and we don't live in you can't really do any of this stuff without giving people a lot of money, in my opinion. But, Fauci, yeah, Fauci is I don't want to say anything. I don't want to get. Yeah, I know that vaccine hesitant is not the same as anti-vax. There's a difference. I agree. I guess. I'm not sure. But yeah, the booster was a good time. Damn that vaccine. All right, guys, my mind has changed. That's great. We got an essential worker who never got COVID. You should compare stories to an essential worker who did get COVID. Yeah, anthrax. That is true. I gotta have my mom. You know, Nora Eisenberg, my mother, wrote a whole book about Gulf War syndrome. So I have to see what she says about that. Anthrax vaccine. Was it anthrax? I thought it was a malaria vaccine. It was a malaria one. President Jesus. Yeah. So I will say, oh yeah, they're not vaccines. Okay. All right. Anyway, don't be anti-vax. Get vaccinated. And I love when people say very disappointing, Katie. Like, do they think that I really it's just such a very disappointing, Katie. Do better. What happened to you? All of those things are so fucking annoying. They're so annoying. They just make me that much more like I'm just that much more kind of unfairly, but you're shut down. I don't consider what you say because it's so condescending. And I don't know who you are. It's like it assumes like, "Oh, wow, XYZ 333 is disappointed in me. How can I go on? Must go on, can't go on, must go on." That's like the process that happens inside. All right. I'm above it. Let it go. Sometimes it's fun to all right. Wait. Your mom's a saint. We love her. Thank you. I'm for A now. Laura Jean, thanks, Katie. As someone who works in hospitals, we need more people to get vaccinated. Oh, who's Laura a shill for? Who's paying Laura off? What is Laura getting from big pharma to spread this nonsense? Or she's a sheeple. She's just one of the many sheeple. Right? What else is there? She's a shill. She's a sheeple shill. She's what is it? Sheeple shill. A spiel. She's a spiel. Who is paying off Laura? What is it that Laura doesn't want you to know? What is Laura hiding? What is Fauci forcing? What does Fauci have on Laura? What does Walensky have on Laura? Who pays Laura to say that? Why is Laura Laura probably jumps off the, what are those animals that do that jump off the things? Laura's just naive. She's a sheeple shill. It's a hell of a silly tongue twister. It is, right? Just got turned into lizard. I can't climb walls. Who cares about webbed feet? It sucks. Don't get Moderna booster go for Pfizer instead to climb walls. Thank you, Phantomus. Anyway, sorry, Laura, for sicking my followers on you, but you got it. I got to get out the truth. I got it. People must know. People must know. Sheeple must be shamed. I must shame sheeple shills. Sheeple shills will be shamed. They'll be smeared. Lemmings. Lemmings do not wait. Laura and Pharma both end in A. It's true. Oh, thank you, Ghassan Maslamani. Thank you for that. Who else do I have? Chartreuse says, you're great. Thank you. Thank you, Chartreuse. Don't pay attention to the Charlie Kirk sycophants, the dude with the weird face. He does have a kind of weird face. Yeah, I don't get this immune health first thing. Wait, is this true? Have I been living a lie this whole time? Lemmings do not jump off cliffs. Look it up. Is that true? Someone has to tell me. Get some sun before the skinwalkers block it. Noam Chomsky went fascist. I don't think I look that pasty. I don't. Someone look up the lemmings. Put in a link. Well, next time I see you guys, it's going to be a new year. Isn't that crazy? Poor lemmings. They get. Have we been wronged about them? Lemmings do follow each other off cliffs. I can't believe Emperor. I can't believe I kind of fell for that. That's awful. Thank you. I'm not pasty at all. Yeah. Well, I will just say Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you. Oh, thanks, John Bracey. You should have Justin Oni on again. This episode was brilliant. Thanks, John. Did I say Johnny? Because I was combining Bracey and John. Chat. COVID makes your blood clot more easily. It can cause neurological damage. It can cause pneumonia. Respiratory distress especially can kill. You run this risk if you look for natural immunity. Oh, sorry. Yeah, if you look for natural immunity, yeah. Katie, you're a riot. I love your combativeness. Thank you. I mean, F you. Just trying to, give you that combativeness you love. Let's see. Best to you. See you next year. Happier 2022, Katie. Baby shrews hold each other's tails and follow like a train. I don't know if any of this is true. I don't want to smear shrews. Katie's on brand. Now go get, I don't know what that means. Well, this COVID world mishigas. Oi, yeah, let's end on that. Let's end on that note. It's true. All right. Well, I will see you guys next year. Thank you so much to everyone who's helped out on the show. And thanks to Brad and Tyler who are here now, and David. Oops. Can't say who that is. Okay. And Varushka, Nick, all of you, all the Patreons. Let's get up this Patreon number. I'll do some AMAs with you. Quarterly AMAs. That would be good, right? Quarterly AMAs. All right. Everyone stay safe. Who knows what I'll be doing on New Year's? I'm upstate again. I'm not in the city. And maybe if I'm here, maybe I'll do a New Year's stream. Who knows? If I don't do anything. That would be fun, right? Kind of sad, kind of fun. I'll let you guys know. But either see you next year or very, very close to the next year, depending on when I do it. Not promising New Year's Eve, but it's a possibility. All right. I'll definitely see you though Sunday. Yeah. I'll definitely see you Sunday and here. Thank you, Brad and Maria and Left Lens and Katie and everyone. Happy New Year's. Yeah, I'll see you guys Sunday and Tuesday. Oh, there are other people doing New Year's streams? Okay. I don't want to clash with them. All right. I will see you guys all soon. Sunday. Bye, all.